Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring at the rain streaking down his window. The city lights blurred into colorful smudges, and for a moment, he wondered if this was what his life had become, a blurred mess with no clear direction. At 32, he felt older than his years. Now, the divorce papers on his coffee table served as a constant reminder of his failures. Sarah had taken everything, the house, the dog, even the friends they once shared. His phone buzzed with work emails, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The marketing firm where he worked felt like a prison. Every day was the same routine: wake up, shower, commute, sit in meetings, pretend to care about campaigns for products he'd never use, come home, and repeat. The success he once chased now felt hollow and meaningless. The knock on his door came. At exactly 9:17 p.m., Marcus knew the time because he'd been watching the digital clock on his microwave, counting down the minutes until he could justify going to bed early again. He wasn't expecting anyone. His few remaining friends had stopped calling weeks ago. Tired of his constant negativity and canceled plans, through the peephole, he saw her. She stood in the hallway with confidence that seemed to radiate even through the fisheye lens. Dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, and she wore a simple black dress that somehow looked elegant despite the late hour. What struck him most were her eyes. They seemed to see right through the door, right through him. "Can I help you?" Marcus called through the door, his voice scratchy from disuse. "I think the question is whether I can help you," she replied, her voice soft but clear. There was something musical about the way she spoke, like each word was carefully chosen for maximum impact. Marcus hesitated. Every instinct told him not to open the door to a stranger, especially not at this hour. Something about her presence felt different. Not threatening, but necessary somehow. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" he asked, still speaking through the door. "Not yet," she said simply. "But I know you, Marcus Chin. I know you're tired of pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I know you wake up every morning wondering if this is all there is to life. I know you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly happy." The accuracy of her words hit him like a physical blow. How could a complete stranger see through him so easily when his own ex-wife had claimed she never really knew him at all? "Do you want?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the deadbolt. "I want to show you that life can be different. That you can be different." Her voice was closer now, as if she'd moved right up against the door. "I can be what you need, Marcus. But only if you let me in." Marcus stared at the door, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in months. The logical part of his brain screamed warnings about stranger danger and common sense. But the larger part of him, the part that had been slowly dying in the monotony of his existence, was desperately curious. "How do you know my name?" he asked. "How is it important right now? What matters is that I'm here and you're there. And we both know you're going to open this door because you have nothing left to lose." She was right, and they both knew it. Marcus had hit rock bottom so hard that even the floor felt negotiable at this point. His marriage was over, his job was unfulfilling, and he hadn't felt genuine emotion in so long that he sometimes wondered if he was capable of it. Anymore? His fingers fumbled with the chain lock, then the deadbolt. The door swung open, and there she was, up close. She was even more striking than he'd imagined. Her skin seemed to glow in the harsh hallway lighting, and when she smiled, it transformed her entire face. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were kind and knowing, as if she carried secrets that could change everything. "Thank you," she said, stepping into his apartment without waiting for an invitation. She moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in any space they occupied. Marcus closed the door behind her, suddenly self-conscious about the state of his apartment. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table, dirty clothes were draped over chairs, and the whole place smelled faintly of resignation. "Sorry about the mess," he mumbled, but she waved off his concern. "I'm not here to judge your housekeeping," she said, settling onto his couch as if she belonged there. "I'm here because you're ready for something new, even if you don't realize it yet." "What exactly are you offering?" Marcus asked, remaining standing by the door, still not entirely convinced this wasn't some elaborate scam or hallucination brought on by too much isolation. She leaned back into the cushions, studying him with those penetrating eyes. Purpose, passion, a reason to wake up in the morning that goes beyond habit and obligation. The chance to become the man you were meant to be before life convinced you to settle for less. And what's the catch? Marcus had learned the hard way that nothing good came without a price. Her smile widened. And for just a moment, something flickered in her expression. Something that might have been sadness or pity or something else entirely. The catch, Marcus, is that once you start down this path with me, there's no going back to who you used to be. The man you are right now, sitting in this apartment feeling sorry for himself, he'll cease to exist. Are you ready for that kind of change? Marcus looked around his apartment, at the evidence of his small, contained life at the divorce papers. That represented his latest failure. Then he looked back at her, this mysterious woman who had appeared like an answer to prayers he'd forgotten how to say. "I don't even know your name," he said. "I'm Alina," she replied. "And this is the first day of your new life, if you're brave enough to take it." The next morning, Marcus woke up, wondering if Alina had been a dream. The rational part of his mind insisted that mysterious, beautiful women didn't just appear at people's doors offering to change their lives. But then he saw the coffee cup. On his kitchen counter, not his usual chipped mug, but an elegant white cup he'd never seen before. Faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air. The same perfume Alina had worn. She'd stayed until nearly midnight, talking about everything and nothing. Alina had a way of asking questions that made Marcus examine his life from angles he'd never considered. She didn't offer solutions or advice. Instead, she listened with the kind of attention that made him feel like every word mattered. When she finally left, she'd simply said, "Tomorrow, we're something that makes you feel confident. Trust me." Now, standing in front of his closet, Marcus realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd dressed with intention rather than obligation. Most of his clothes were variations on the same theme. Gray slacks, white shirts, blue ties, a uniform designed to help him blend into the corporate landscape. But buried in the back, he found the navy suit he'd bought for his wedding. Still fit perfectly, and when he put it on, something shifted in the way he carried himself. At the office, people noticed. Janet from accounting complimented his appearance. His boss, Mr. Richardson, actually made eye contact during their morning meeting instead of staring at his computer screen. Marcus found himself speaking up during discussions, offering ideas that surprised even him. The confidence felt foreign but intoxicating, like trying on a new identity that fit better than his old one. Alina texted him at lunch. "Meet me at Central Park, near the fountain. You'll know which one." Marcus hadn't taken a lunch break in months, always eating sad desk salads while answering emails. But something about Elena's message made him grab his jacket and head for the elevators. He told his assistant he'd be back in an hour, words that felt revolutionary in his previously rigid schedule. Central Park was busy with the usual mix of tourists, joggers and office workers stealing moments of nature in the concrete jungle. But Marcus spotted Alina immediately. She sat on a bench near Bethesda Fountain, feeding pigeons from a small bag of breadcrumbs. She wore jeans and a flowing white blouse that made her look effortlessly elegant, like someone who had never questioned her place in the world. "You came," she said as he approached, not looking up from the birds gathering at her feet. "Did you? Think I wouldn't? I hoped you would. Hope and certainty are different things." She patted the bench beside her, and Marcus sat down, close enough to catch that jasmine scent again. "How did you know I'd find you? There are dozens of fountains in this park." Lena smiled, finally meeting his eyes. "Times when you're ready to see something, you just know where to look. Tell me about your morning." Marcus found himself describing his day in detail, the compliments, the eye contact. The way speaking up in the meeting had felt like flexing a muscle he'd forgotten. Alina listened with that same intense attention she'd shown the night before, nodding at all the right moments. "Confidence is contagious," she said when he finished. "Most people are so starved for genuine presence that they gravitate toward anyone who shows up authentically. You're discovering that you have more power than you realized. Is that what this is about? It's power. It's about becoming who you're meant to be. It's Sometimes that involves power, sometimes it involves surrender. The key is knowing which moment calls for which response. She stood up, scattering the remaining breadcrumbs for the pigeons. Walk with me. They strolled through the park, past couples on blankets and children chasing balloons. Alina pointed out details Marcus had never noticed despite walking these paths countless times, the way shadows fell differently in autumn. The secret language of dog walkers, the stories written in the faces of people sitting alone on benches. You see everything, Marcus said, marveling at her observations. I see what's there. Most people look without seeing because they're too busy thinking about what comes next. The present moment is where life actually happens, but it's the place we spend the least time. They stopped at a small pond where ducks glided across the surface with deceptive ease. Alina picked up a smooth stone and handed it to Marcus. Skip it, she said. I haven't done that since I was a kid. Exactly. Marcus weighed the stone in his palm, remembering summer afternoons at his grandmother's lake house, back when the future felt infinite and full of possibility. He drew his arm back and sent the stone sailing across the water. It skipped 4 times before sinking, and something in his chest loosened with each bounce. Alina clapped. A genuine expression of delight that made him feel like he'd accomplished something meaningful. When was the last time you did something just because it brought you joy? The question hit harder than expected. Marcus couldn't remember. Every decision in his adult life had been filtered through practicality, responsibility, or social expectations. Joy had become a luxury he couldn't afford, then eventually something he'd forgotten to want. I don't know, he admitted. Going to change. Lena sat on a large rock by the water's edge and Marcus joined her. Tonight I want you to do 3 things you enjoyed as a child but stopped doing as an adult. Don't overthink it, just follow the impulse. That sounds ... scary? Silly? Irresponsible? Elena's smile was patient. All the best adventures start that way. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the ducks and listening to the distant sounds of the city. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. This woman, this Alina, was awakening parts of himself he'd thought were dead. Can I ask you something? He said finally. Of course. Why me? Why did you choose me? Alina was quiet for a long moment, her expression growing thoughtful. Do you believe in timing, Marcus? The idea that sometimes the universe conspires to put exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. I never used to, but now. Marcus looked at her profile, the way sunlight caught the curve of her cheek, the certainty in her posture that seemed to anchor everything around her. Now I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong about a lot of things. She turned to face him fully, and again he felt that sensation of being completely seen. You were ready to be different, ready to take risks, ready to remember who you is. Used to be, before the world convinced you to be smaller. I can sense that readiness in people. It calls to me. And then what happens? Then we find out together. Alina stood and brushed dust from her jeans. I have to go now. But remember 3 things from childhood that brought you joy. Don't think, just do. She started to walk away, then turned back. And Marcus, that confidence you felt this morning? It wasn't me giving you anything you didn't already have. It just reminded you it was there. She disappeared into the crowd of park visitors. Marcus remained by the pond, watching the ducks and feeling like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. He could step back into the safety of his old life, or he could jump and trust that somehow he would learn to fly. That evening, Marcus stood in the middle of a toy store, feeling completely out of place among the bright colors and cheerful chaos. A mother pushed past him with a screaming toddler, and teenagers clustered around the latest gaming displays. But Marcus remained frozen in the model airplane aisle, staring at a remote-controlled helicopter. He'd been 12 when his father taught him to fly model planes in the empty lot behind their house. Those Saturday mornings had been magical, just him, his dad, and the impossible dream of defying gravity. The planes crashed more often than they flew, but Marcus had loved the challenge, the patience required. The moment when everything aligned perfectly and something man-made soared like it was born to the sky. His phone buzzed. A text from Alina. Trust the impulse. Marcus bought the helicopter. The second thing happened by accident. Walking home with his purchase, he passed a street musician playing guitar near the subway entrance. The man's case was open, collecting coins and crumpled bills from passers-by. But it wasn't the music that stopped Marcus. It was the harmonica sitting unused beside the guitar case. "You play?" the musician asked during a break between songs. "Used to," Marcus replied, remembering the harmonica his grandfather had given him for his 10th birthday. He'd carried it everywhere, driving his family crazy with endless practice sessions until he could finally play Amazing Grace without missing a note. "Want to sit in?" The musician gestured to the harmonica. "I could use a backup." Before his adult mind could list all the reasons this was inappropriate, he was wearing an expensive suit. People might stare. He was probably terrible after 20 years. Marcus found himself sitting on the curb, the harmonica cool against his lips. The first notes were shaky, uncertain. But muscle memory kicked in, and suddenly he was playing along to the times they were a-changing, the Dylan song he'd mastered in high school. A small crowd gathered, and for 20 minutes, Marcus was not a failed husband or a corporate drone. He was simply music, breathing life into metal and making something beautiful with a stranger. When they finished, the crowd applauded and dropped money into the case. The musician grinned and offered to split the earnings, but Marcus waved him off and walked away, still carrying the taste of music on his tongue. The third thing found him at home. Unpacking the helicopter, Marcus discovered he was humming something he hadn't done in years. The sound made his apartment feel different, warmer somehow. On impulse, he pulled out his phone and called his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who always seemed lonely. "Would you like to come over for dinner?" he asked. "I'm making spaghetti." Mrs. Patterson sounded surprised but pleased. "Haven't been invited to dinner in months? Dear, are you sure?" Marcus looked around his messy apartment and felt something he'd almost forgotten, the desire to make someone else happy just because he could. "I'm sure. Give me an hour to clean up." Cooking dinner for someone else transported him back to childhood evenings, helping his mother in the kitchen, when food was about love rather than just fuel. He found himself actually tasting the sauce, adjusting seasoning, caring about the outcome. In a way that felt revolutionary, Mrs. Patterson arrived with a bottle of wine and stories that made Marcus laugh until his cheeks hurt. She told him about her late husband's terrible jokes, her garden's ongoing war with neighborhood squirrels, and her secret dream of learning to tango at 78. "You seem different tonight, Marcus," she observed over dessert. "Lighter somehow." "Trying some new things," he said, which felt like both the truth and a massive understatement. "Good for you." Harold used to say that the day you stop trying new things is the day you start dying. He never stopped trying new things, right up until the end. After Mrs. Patterson left, Marcus sat on his couch with the helicopter remote in his hands. The apartment felt different, not just cleaner, but more alive. The laughter still echoed, faintly. The lingering smell of garlic and wine made the space feel like a home, instead of just a place to sleep. His phone rang. Alina. "How did it go?" she asked, without preamble. "Strange. Good strange, but strange." Marcus found himself telling her about the helicopter, the street music, the dinner with Mrs. Patterson, as he spoke. He realized how full the evening had felt compared to his usual routine of takeout and television. "You remembered how to play," Elena said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Is that what this is? Playing?" Play is how children learn about the world. It's how they discover who they are and what they're capable of. Adults forget that. Growth doesn't stop just because you get older. We just stop playing, so we stop growing. Marcus looked at the helicopter sitting on his coffee table, its sleek red body promising adventures he'd forgotten were possible. What happens now? Now you keep playing. Keep trying. Keep remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Elena's voice grew softer. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. This journey we're on together, it's going to ask things of you that might feel uncomfortable. You're going to have to make choices that don't make sense to the old version of yourself." "What kind of choices?" "Tomorrow, you'll know. Trust me, and more importantly, trust yourself. You have better instincts than you think." After hanging up, Marcus spent an hour learning to pilot the helicopter around his apartment. It crashed spectacularly several times, knocking over a lamp and nearly taking out Mrs. Patterson's wine bottle. But each failure taught him something new, and eventually he managed to hover the little aircraft steady in the center of his living room as he guided it through a careful figure-8 pattern. Marcus thought about Elena's words. The old version of himself would have been horrified by tonight's activities, spending money on toys, playing music in public like some kind of street performer, inviting near strangers over for dinner. But the man sitting here now, laughing as he navigated a toy helicopter through impossible aerial maneuvers, felt more real than he had in years. His reflection in the darkened window showed someone he barely recognized. Same face, same hair, but the expression was completely different. There was curiosity there, and anticipation, and something that might have been hope. The helicopter's battery finally died, and Marcus set it down gently on the coffee table. Tomorrow would bring another day at the office, another chance to pretend. He was satisfied with his small, safe life. But tonight had proven something important. That version of himself was just another role he'd been playing. And he was tired of the performance. He picked up his phone to text Alina, then stopped. Whatever she meant about choices and trust, he'd find out soon enough. For now, it was enough to sit in his transformed apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life that suddenly felt worth living, and remember what it felt like to be surprised. By his own capacity for joy, outside, the city hummed with 8 million other stories. But for the first time in months, Marcus was genuinely curious about where his own story might lead. The helicopter sat silent on the table, ready for tomorrow's adventures, and Marcus fell asleep on the couch with a smile on his face, dreaming of flying. The choice Elena had warned him about came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, in the form of an email that would change everything. Marcus was sitting in yet another mind-numbing meeting about quarterly projections when his phone buzzed with a message. That made his heart race. There's an art gallery opening tonight. The artist is someone you need to meet. Cancel whatever you had planned and be there at 7. Address attached. This is important, Marcus. More important than you can imagine. Right now. The rational part of his brain immediately began cataloging objections. He had a presentation to finish for tomorrow's client meeting. His boss expected the quarterly reports by end of day. He'd already left work early twice this week, and people were starting to notice his changed behavior. His going to some random art gallery opening felt irresponsible, even reckless. But as he sat there listening to his colleagues debate conversion rates and market penetration strategies, Marcus felt the walls of his old life pressing in around him. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the corporate speak more meaningless, the whole environment suddenly suffocating in its predictability. He thought about the helicopter, gathering dust on his coffee table. The harmonica music still echoing in his memory, Mrs. Patterson's delighted laughter over dinner. When had he stopped believing that spontaneity was possible? When had security become more important than curiosity? At 4:30, Marcus made his choice. He saved his presentation half-finished, sent a brief email about feeling under the weather, and walked out of the office building into the late afternoon sunlight. His phone immediately started buzzing with concerned messages from his assistant, but he turned it off and headed home to prepare for whatever Elena had planned. The gallery was in Soho, tucked between a vintage clothing store and an Ethiopian restaurant Marcus had never noticed despite walking this street dozens of times. The opening was already in full swing when he arrived, the space filled with people who looked like they belonged in a world far more interesting than his corporate existence. The artist's work was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Large canvases covered in what appeared to be layers of paint, sand, and embedded objects, pieces of glass, fragments of text, strips of fabric, all somehow forming coherent images that seemed to shift and change depending on where you are. Stood, they tell stories, a voice said beside him. Marcus turned to find a man in his 60s, paint-stained fingers wrapped around a glass of wine, watching Marcus examine the largest piece in the collection. I'm sorry, the paintings? They tell stories, but different ones, depending on who's looking and when. That one you're studying, I call it Before the Fall. Some people see a woman dancing. Others see someone jumping off a cliff. A few see both at the same time. The man extended his hand. I'm David Chen, by the way. The artist, unfortunately. Marcus shook hands, startled by the coincidence of names. Marcus Chen. No relation, I assume. In a city of 8 million, probably. Not, though stranger things have happened. David studied Marcus with the same intensity Marcus had been applying to the artwork. What do you see in Before the Fall? Marcus looked back at the canvas, trying to focus beyond the initial visual chaos. Gradually, shapes began to emerge from the textured surface. I see someone standing at the edge of something. Not falling. Not dancing, just ... deciding. Like they're trying to choose between who they used to be and who they might become. David's eyebrows rose. That's remarkably specific. And remarkably accurate to what I was thinking when I painted it. Do you have art training? No, I work in marketing, or I did until recently. The words surprised Marcus. He hadn't realized. He was already thinking of his corporate job in past tense. A fellow refugee from the corporate world. I spent 15 years in finance before I remembered I had a soul. David gestured around the gallery. This is my 5th year doing what I love, instead of what I thought I should do. Best decision I ever made, even though it nearly killed me. Financially, they were interrupted by Elena's arrival. She appeared at Marcus's elbow, as if she'd materialized from thin air. Wearing a dark green dress that made her eyes look like forest pools. You came, she said, touching his arm briefly. The simple contact sent electricity through him. Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would. David, I see you've met Marcus. Marcus looked between them, suddenly understanding that this meeting was no coincidence. You two know each other. Elena has been a patron and friend for years, David explained. She has an eye for potential that's almost supernatural. When she told me about you, I was intrigued. Oh. I told you what about me? Elena stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell that familiar jasmine scent, that you're ready for the next step. That you're tired of living someone else's life and ready to start living your own. I don't understand. David sat down. His wine glass had moved to stand in front of a smaller canvas Marcus hadn't noticed before. This one was different from the others, cleaner lines. Brighter colors, but with the same layered complexity that made David's work so compelling. I need an assistant, David said simply. Someone to help with research, handle the business side of things, maybe even learn some techniques if they're interested. It doesn't pay much at first, probably 1/3 of what you're making now. But it's real work, meaningful work. Work that feeds the soul instead of just paying bills. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. You're offering me a job? Offering you a chance to find out who you are when you're not pretending to be someone else? David's voice was gentle but firm. Lena tells me you've been rediscovering things about yourself lately. This would be a way to continue that process while building something meaningful. Marcus looked around the gallery at the art that somehow spoke directly to parts of himself he'd forgotten existed. At the people who moved through the space with a kind of engaged energy he hadn't felt in years. At Elena, watching him with those knowing eyes. I can't, he said finally. I have responsibilities, mortgage, insurance, a career I've spent 10 years building. You have a job you hate that's slowly killing your spirit, Elena said quietly. What you don't have is a life worth living. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Standing in this gallery, surrounded by evidence of someone who had chosen passion over security and made it work, Marcus could see his own life with terrible clarity. The apartment he barely enjoyed living in, the work that drained him without fulfilling him. The routine that had become a prison he'd locked himself into and thrown away the key. What if I'm not good at it, he asked. What if I fail? What if you don't? David countered. What if you discover you have talents you never knew existed? What if you find out that the life you've been living isn't the only option available to you? Elena moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence like warmth from a fire. Remember what I told you about choices, Marcus? This is one of them. You can go back to your office tomorrow and pretend. Tonight never happened. You can finish your presentation and submit your reports and continue the slow fade into a life that looks successful from the outside but feels empty from the inside, or Or you can trust that the man who bought a helicopter and played harmonica on the street and cooked dinner for a lonely neighbor might be capable of more than he ever imagined. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. In his mind, he could see two versions of his future stretching out like parallel roads. One led back to fluorescent lights and quarterly meetings and the slow suffocation of dreams deferred. The other led into uncertainty, but also possibility, the chance to discover whether there was more to Marcus Chen than anyone, including himself, had ever suspected. When he opened his eyes, David and Alina were watching him with expressions of patient expectation, like they already knew what he would choose. "When would you need an answer?" Marcus asked. David smiled. "How about now? I've got a new piece I'm starting tomorrow, and I could use an extra pair of hands. Think you can handle some paint under your fingernails?" Marcus looked down at his expensive suit, his polished shoes, all the armor of his corporate identity. Then he looked back at the painting that had first caught his attention, the figure standing at the edge of decision, choosing between who they used to be and who they might become. "Yes," he said, the word coming out stronger than he'd expected. "Yes, I think I can." 3 months into his new life, Marcus barely recognized the man he used to be. His hands were permanently stained with paint now, his expensive suits traded for jeans and t-shirts that could survive accidental encounters with turpentine and charcoal. The corporate apartment, with its sterile surfaces, had been exchanged for a small loft in Brooklyn, where he could hear David working in the studio below and where Alina visited almost daily, bringing coffee and insights that continued to reshape his understanding of himself. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first month had been a constant battle between exhilaration and terror. His savings account dwindled at an alarming rate, and his former colleagues looked at him with mixtures of pity and bewilderment when he ran into them on the street. His ex-wife Sarah had called once, having heard through mutual friends about his career change. "Are you having some kind of breakdown?" she'd asked, her voice sharp with the familiar disapproval that had poisoned the final years of their marriage. "Maybe," Marcus had replied, surprising them both with his honesty. "Or maybe I'm finally having a breakthrough." Despite the financial stress and social confusion, Marcus woke up each morning with something he'd forgotten existed: anticipation. Working with David was like discovering a language he'd always known but never been taught to speak. The older man was generous with his knowledge, patient with Marcus's mistakes, and surprisingly wise about the process of rebuilding a life from the ground up. Art isn't about creating pretty things, David had explained during one of their late night conversations in the studio. It's about telling the truth so clearly that other people recognize it in themselves. That's what Alina saw in you, the capacity to recognize truth when you see it, even when it's uncomfortable. Alina herself remained an enigma wrapped in jasmine perfume and knowing smiles. She appeared in Marcus's life at exactly the moments he needed her most, when doubt crept in, when fear threatened to send him running back to his old life, when he needed reminding that growth often felt like falling before it felt like flying. Their relationship had evolved into something Marcus couldn't quite categorize. More than friendship, not quite romance, but deeper than either, in ways that defied conventional labels. She challenged him constantly, pushing him toward discoveries about himself that were equal parts thrilling and terrifying. "You're holding back," she told him one evening as they walked through Prospect Park. Marcus had been struggling with a piece. David had assigned him a mixed media exploration of transition that felt too personal, too revealing. "It's not good enough yet," Marcus protested. "I need more time to develop the concept." Alina stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression more serious than usual. "Marcus, do you trust me?" "Course!" "Then trust me when I tell you that your fear of not being good enough is exactly what's preventing you from being great. The piece you're avoiding is the most important work you'll ever create, precisely because it scares you. What if people don't understand it? What if they do? What if they see exactly what you're trying to hide and love you for it anyway?" That night, Marcus worked until dawn, pouring months of confusion and transformation onto canvas and paper. He used techniques David had taught him, but also impulses that came from somewhere deeper, the part of himself that Alina had been awakening since that first night she'd appeared at his door. The finished piece was raw, vulnerable, unpolished by traditional standards. But it pulsed with honest emotion in a way that made Marcus's chest tight when he looked at it. David found him staring at it the next morning, exhausted but oddly exhilarated. "Now that," David said quietly, "is art." The piece depicted a man, standing at the edge of a cliff, but instead of falling, he was growing wings. The wings weren't beautiful or perfect. They were made of newspaper clippings from his old life, fragments of business cards, pieces of his old suits, but they were strong enough to carry him. Around the figure, the world was splitting into two. One half showed the gray, sterile corporate landscape he'd left behind, while the other half exploded with color and possibility. David helped him frame it properly, and they displayed it in the gallery's next group show. Marcus watched from across the room as strangers stood before his work with expressions of recognition and wonder. A woman with tears in her eyes approached him afterward. "That piece," she said, gesturing toward his work. "It's exactly how I felt when I left my marriage, like I was dying and being born at the same time." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. That was exactly what he tried to capture, the terrifying beauty of letting one version of yourself die so another could live. The piece sold within a week to a collector who called it brutally honest and transformative. Marcus stared at the check, his first real income from his art, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a hobby anymore, or a midlife crisis, or an elaborate form of self-destruction. This was real, but success brought its own complications. As word spread about his artistic talent, Marcus began receiving offers that felt suspiciously familiar. A high-end advertising agency wanted to hire him as their creative director. A luxury brand offered him a lucrative contract to create lifestyle art for their marketing campaigns. Even his old firm reached out, suggesting he return as head of their new creative innovation department. The money they were offering was staggering. More than he'd ever made in his corporate life, with the promise of creative freedom and flexible schedules. On paper, it looked like the perfect solution to his financial struggles, while still allowing him to pursue his artistic passion. "They're trying to buy back the old you," Alina observed when Marcus showed her the stack of offers. They were sitting in his loft, sharing takeout Chinese food, and watching the sunset paint the Brooklyn skyline in shades of gold and pink. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Marcus said, though even as he spoke the words, they felt wrong in his mouth. "These offers would solve all my financial problems. I could keep making art on the side." Alina set down her chopsticks and fixed him with that penetrating stare he'd come to both love and fear. "Marcus, do you remember what I told you that first night? About there being no going back once you started this journey? Of course, this is what I meant. These offers aren't opportunities, they're tests. The universe is asking you to choose definitively who you want to be." Marcus felt the familiar flutter of panic in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when Alina first appeared at his door. When David offered him the job, when every major choice in his new life had demanded, he trusts something deeper than logic. "But I could use the money to support my real work," he said, hearing the weakness in his own argument. "No." Alina's voice was firm, almost sharp.
Ow.
"The moment you start treating your art as a side project to be funded by work that diminishes, you begin the slow slide back into the person you used to be. I've seen it happen to dozens of people, Marcus. They convince themselves they're being practical, responsible, but what they're really doing is choosing comfort over courage." Marcus felt a flicker of irritation. "Easy for you to say. You don't seem to have any financial concerns." Not everyone can afford to be an idealist." The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus immediately regretted them. But something in Elena's expression told him he'd touched on something important, something she'd been avoiding. Alina was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city lights. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but somehow sadder than he'd ever heard it. "You're right. I don't have financial concerns, but not for the reasons you think." She stood up and walked to the window, her silhouette dark against the dying light. "Marcus, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago." Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in his studio space, surrounded by canvases and half-finished sculptures, trying to untangle the knot of emotions Elena's revelation had created. Every few minutes, he found himself reaching for his phone. To call her, then stopping. What was there to say that wouldn't sound like accusation or pleading? By dawn, he'd made his decision. Or rather, several decisions that felt like different facets of the same crystalline truth. First, he called each of the companies that had made him offers and politely but firmly declined. The conversation with his former boss was particularly satisfying, especially when Marcus realized he felt nothing but pity for the man's obvious confusion about why anyone would choose uncertainty over a guaranteed paycheck. Second, he called David and asked if he could extend their partnership arrangement. The older man agreed without hesitation, mentioning that he'd been hoping Marcus would stay permanently, but hadn't wanted to pressure him. Third, spent the afternoon creating a new piece, something different from anything he'd done before. This one wasn't about transformation or struggle or identity. This one was about love. About the terrifying, exhilarating moment when you realize that becoming your best self requires both solitude and partnership, both independence and connection. Elena appeared at his door that evening, as if summoned by the completion of his work. She looked different, less composed, more human somehow. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore jeans and a simple white t-shirt instead of one of her elegant dresses. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble. "So have I." So have I. Doorway, both of them changed by the previous night's revelations. Both unsure of the protocol for navigating this new territory. "Can I come in?" Lena asked. Marcus stepped aside and she entered his loft, immediately noticing the new piece dominating the center of the room. She approached it slowly, and Marcus watched her face as she took in the swirling colors and embedded elements that somehow conveyed both chaos and harmony. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "What do you call it?" "Learning to fly together," Marcus replied. "It's about realizing that some things are only possible when two people choose to trust each other completely." Elena turned to face him, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Marcus, I'm sorry. I should have told you about my family, about the money. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning." "Yes, you should have, but I understand why you didn't." Marcus moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability he saw in her expression. "I've spent my whole life being defined by what I could offer other people as an employee, a husband, a member of society. You were afraid I'd see you the same way, as a means to an end rather than as Elena, were you? Afraid of that? I mean," Marcus considered the question honestly. "For about 30 seconds last night? Yes. There was a moment when I wondered if accepting your help would make things easier. But then I realized that easy isn't what I want anymore. I want real. I want to earn what I have, including your love." Lena laughed, a sound mixed with tears. "And relief, you can't earn love, Marcus. It's not a transaction or an achievement. It's just something that happens when two people see each other clearly and choose to stay anyway. Then that's what I'm choosing, to stay. To build this life I've discovered with you in it if you want to be there, but because it's the life that makes me most myself. Not because it's the life that makes me most comfortable." Elena closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled slightly. "I want to be here, not as your benefactor or your patron or your safety net. Just as Elena, the woman who saw something in you that first night that you couldn't see in yourself." And what was that? Courage. The kind of courage it takes to let someone in when letting them in might change everything. Marcus pulled her into his arms, finally understanding what Alina had meant about there being no going back. The man who had opened his door to her 6 months ago no longer existed. In his place stood someone stronger, more authentic, more capable of both giving and receiving love. The journey from who he'd been to who he'd become had required destroying almost everything he'd thought he wanted. What had grown from the ashes was infinitely more valuable. "So what happens now?" he asked, echoing the question that had been haunting him since their first meeting. "We find out what we can build together. I have some ideas about supporting emerging artists that don't involve compromising their integrity or independence. David might be interested in expanding his mentorship program. And you." She smiled. "You keep making art that tells the truth so clearly that other people recognize themselves in it." Marcus looked around his loft at the paintings that represented his artistic evolution, at Alina surrounded by the physical evidence of his transformation, at the life he'd built from scratch when he'd finally found the courage to abandon the life that had been slowly killing him. "I used to think happiness was about achieving certain goals," he said. "The right job, the right marriage, the right amount of money in the bank, but it's not about achieving anything, is it? It's about becoming someone you actually want to be. And are you someone you want to be?" Marcus considered the question seriously. The man he was now bore little resemblance to the Marcus Chen, who had sat alone in a corporate apartment 6 months ago, drowning in the quiet desperation of an unfulfilling life. This version was messier, less secure, more vulnerable. It was also more alive, more present, more capable of both joy and meaningful struggle. "I'm getting there," he said finally. "Every day I'm getting closer to being someone I can actually respect." Alina smiled and leaned into him, her head resting against his chest where she could hear his heartbeat. Steady now. It's no longer racing with anxiety about who he was supposed to be or what he was supposed to want. Outside, Brooklyn hummed with the sounds of 8 million other stories, other people struggling to figure out who they were and who they wanted to become. But inside the loft, surrounded by art that bore witness to the possibility of transformation, Marcus and Alina had found something rare, the courage to be authentically themselves, someone who loved them for it. The helicopter still sat on Marcus's bookshelf, a reminder of the night he'd remembered how to play. But now it shared space with paintbrushes and sketches, with photos of gallery openings and dinner parties with Mrs. Patterson, with all the physical evidence of a life lived deliberately rather than by default. "I love you," Marcus said, the words carrying weight they'd never held in his previous relationships. Not the desperate clinging of someone afraid of being alone, but the generous gift of someone who had learned to love himself first. "Love you too," Alina replied. "All of you. The man you were, the man you're becoming, and everyone you'll grow into along the way." As night fell over the city, they stood together at the window, watching lights flicker on in apartments where other people were making their own choices about who to be and how to live. Marcus thought about the version of himself who might have been sitting in a sterile corporate apartment right now, eating takeout alone and wondering why success felt so much like failure. That man was gone now, as completely as if he'd never existed. In his place stood someone braver, someone willing to risk everything for the chance to become authentic. Someone who understood that the most important question wasn't "what do I have?" or even "what do I do?" but "who am I when no one is watching, and is that someone I can love?" Marcus had found his answer, and it had changed everything. The whispered promise Alina had made that first night, "I can be what you need," had come true in ways neither of them had expected. She hadn't given him a new life. She'd given him the courage to claim the life that had been waiting for him all along. And in return, he'd given her something she'd never had. Someone who loved her for who she truly was, not what she could provide. Together, they'd learned that the best transformations aren't about becoming someone else. They're about finally having the courage to become who you've always been. Underneath all the fear and compromise and other people's expectations, it was Marcus. Realized the most beautiful kind of love story, not about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone who helps you remember that you were never incomplete to begin with.